Now, today in our history bit, we want to share something that is associated with Yom Kippur. We did mention something about this in our commemorating of Yom Kippur. I found it fitting to share this as part of our history bit. And this history bit is entitled Scapegoat or Azazel. In the scriptures, when we look at Leviticus chapter 16, verse 8, and most of us who are in the Western world, in particular among the English-speaking peoples, we are accustomed to hearing the term scapegoat. That term scapegoat has been used many times to refer to a person upon which blame is being put, but is not really the one responsible for the blame. That's the way in which it has come to be used in the English-speaking world, in particular in the European and American culture. But this word actually came from the Bible. But the term that we see, the word scapegoat, was not a term that was a part of the original Hebrew text of the scriptures. It was a word that was inserted into the English translation of the scriptures. So when we look at the Geneva Bible, which was produced in 1599, and this was a very popular English translation back in its day. When one would read Leviticus chapter 16, verse 8, in the text where it refers to lots being cast for the two goats to determine whether one of the goats will be designated for Yahuwah and the other goat would be designated for someone else. In the English Bibles, it would read that the other goat would be for the scapegoat. And that same translation, or shall I say in the way in which that verse was translated when the King James Version was produced, and I believe most of us are very familiar with the King James Version of the Bible. It has definitely been the Bible or go-to Bible for much of the Western Christian Protestant world for the past 200 years. The King James Version is the most popular. Of course, within the past 60 years of our lifetime, there have been many versions that have been produced that have somewhat now eclipsed the use of the King James Version. But for the most part, the King James Version is the go-to Bible. And when that one was produced in 1611, which was just 12 years after the Geneva Bible, it also had the same language of the scapegoat. Now, when we look at the Hebrew text of Scripture, the Hebrew text of Scripture reads something a little differently. The way the Hebrew text would read from a literal translation, it would say the goat designated for Yahuwah, and the other goat is designated for Azazel. So this name Azazel is mysterious somewhat, especially to the minds of those who only know about the scapegoat when they read the scriptures. What is or who is Azazel when you read it from the Hebrew scriptures? Now, in more recent translations that are in the English, the literal translation has been placed there. I have a translation called the New Revised Standard Version, and it translates it as Azazel, literally. But when we look at this name, Azazel, what one will have to ask is, who is Azazel? The original language presents the information as though of the two goats used in the atonement on the Day of Atonement, one was designated for a person. The name is Yahuwah. The other is designated for a person, Azazel. That's the way the language is presented. That one is for this one and the other is for that one. So we have to ask, who is Azazel? Now, in the early formations of the Protestant movement, while they were breaking away from the Catholic Church, they kind of, and this is my opinion, threw out the baby with the bathwater, if I can say that, with reference to prevailing ideas that had existed. For they began to reject the notion that is revealed in the scriptures and also in a book called the Book of Enoch, that angels took on human form and married women and produced giants. With the rejection of that notion among many of the Protestant groups that developed, and I say this because I went to Bible college and was trained from a Protestant dispensational perspective. And as we were taught, as the views were shared, that in the Bible, when it talks about the sons of Elohim marrying the daughters of men, that's noted in the book of Bereshit or Genesis chapter 6, that it referred to human beings marrying women. But according to the belief of the ancient Messianic Israelites, and not only among the ancient Messianic Israelites, but even among the various sects within the faith of Israel in the first century, that would be the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and amongst those today, even within Rabbinic Judaism, they believe that when the scriptures refer to the sons of Elohim marrying the daughters of men, it refers to angels. This was an already accepted belief and understanding. So when we get to the era of the Protestant movement and their rejection of these notions, instead of translating the Hebrew text as the goat designated for Azazel, they said the scapegoat, or the one for the scapegoat, because they wanted to change the perspective. They wanted to change the idea, because I guess to believe that angels could take on human form and marry women is a bit too out there. But what we see is, regarding this Azazel, is that Azazel refers to an angel that had come down and was involved in the corruption of humankind before the flood. We know when we read in Enoch, in particular chapter 7 through chapter 10, verse 8, it gives us the details, and it describes this Azazel, and it talks about what he did. But what I want to do, I want to provide a reference there. I'm not going to read all of those chapters, but I do want to provide a reference in the 8th verse of chapter 10 of Enoch, because this particular verse is where we find the reference of Azazel and the reason for this goat being designated for Azazel as a part of the atonement. I want to read verse 8 of chapter 10 of the book of Enoch. And it says, and the whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin. So when we take a look in the book of Enoch, we find in the book of Enoch this mystery person, Azazel. We find that as we look at the description of what Azazel did, as noted by Enoch, and the fact that according to the writing, the Almighty had ascribed all sin to him. In other words, he is the one responsible for the corruption of humanity prior to the flood. Now in the atonement, there's a goat designated, and that goat, which was designated for Azazel, had all of the sins of the house of Israel transferred to it, and then it was sent out in the wilderness. The place where in Enoch, it talks about that Azazel would be put into a pit located in the wilderness or the desert. And so with that in mind, I trust that this has helped us to see something and to be able to value the importance of always looking into the original text of the scriptures. One might ask, why would translators change words? My answer is because in previous generations, you had leaders and movements that had an agenda, that had a belief system, that for some reason or another could not reconcile in their understanding and reasoning how certain things could be. As I wrap this up, I believe personally that because it was a time also of the development of the Renaissance era, the age of reasoning, the budding of science, and many of those things that were occurring in Europe, because they were occurring in Europe during this time, that many of the European leaders, because that's primarily where the Protestant movement began to also think and reason along those lines. Just as in our world today, many of us who believe the scriptures have to sometimes stop and think and begin to reevaluate how we understand the world around us, how we think, how we see things, because whether directly or indirectly, we are influenced by the data, the information, the things we see, the things we hear, the things that we allow to come into our mind, and it influences our way of thinking and believing. And for some of us, we just can't fathom certain things can be so. I believe this is also what was going on during that time. What I want to encourage each one to possibly consider is that with Elohim, all things are possible. But just as with Elohim, all things are possible, there is another side. There is a side that is opposed to Elohim, and he has bestowed power and he has bestowed abilities to other beings that he has created. And there, in time past, has been an exercise of those powers and those abilities. And in time present, there will also be an exercise of those powers and those abilities. Now, whether we're willing to accept it or not, that's on you. But I just want us to consider that we begin to accept the scriptures just the way they are, regardless of how crazy it may sound or seem. Scriptures are the scriptures. So I trust that this information has been helpful, that it has been informative, and that it causes us to continue searching and be open to the revelation of the truth. The Almighty be praised.